welcome back to the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. I'm Stella, Roque, Director of Community Engagement at ICFJ, based out in Washington, D.C. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the top winners of the forum's COVID-19 Reporting Contest and have the chance to discuss each of their stories and what made them compelling. Importantly, before this webinar begins, I want to give a shout out to our judges panel, Jennifer Doro, ICFJ Senior Program Director, Nasser Ulhadi, ICFJ Knight Fellow and co-founder of Proto in India, and David Moss, Director of IJNet, for reading through all of our entries in the English language submissions. Ooh. And importantly, for those of you who are joining as attendants or who are watching this live stream from the forum group, please post your questions to the Zoom chat below or post them directly to the live stream on the Facebook group, and I will moderate those questions at the end of the presentation. And now, introducing our winners, congratulations to all of you. I'm so happy to have you here today. So our number one winner in the science and health category is Priscila Pacheco and Alexandre de Maio, based out in Brazil. They worked with a cross-border team in Poland and Spain as well to produce a story called Favelas versus COVID-19, published on Outriders. In the transparency, crime, and corruption category, our number one winner is Clair MacDougall, based out in Burkina Faso. She wrote an intense story about a UN peacekeeper who allegedly died of COVID-19, and it's a story about accountability, transparency, and access to information. It's titled, "In Mali, the first death of a UN peacekeeper from COVID-19 keeps his family guessing," published on Pass Blue. In the inequality, business, and economics section, we're honoring journalist Amir Khafagy. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Amir? I just want to make sure.
It's Amir Khafagy.
Amir Khafagy, who's based out in New York City, and his story, Black Lives Matter on the Picket Line, was published in Discourse blog, and it's a really in-depth story about a sanitation worker strike in New Orleans in the context of the Black Lives Matters protests. So we're going to start our discussion by talking to our science and health winners first, Priscila and Alexandre, out in Brazil. And this is the first time we're trying simultaneous translation on Zoom. So we have Natalia Rio Preto here, who is translating their responses into English. So hopefully nothing goes wrong technically, but this is our first time trying it. So forgive us if there is any technical glitches that I haven't caught. So Priscila and Alexandre, I would like to ask both of you, and maybe I'm going to start with Priscila and then talk with Alexandre. How did you get your start in journalism, and how long have you been at it? Oh, Priscila, I think you need to unmute. Yes, there you go.
Bom, eu me formei no fim de 2014 em jornalismo. E eu comecei, já em 2015, eu comecei a atuar numa agência de jornalismo chamada Mural, Agência de Jornalismo das Periferias. E eu fiquei nessa agência entre 2015 e o fim de 2019, então eu tenho, acho que boa parte da minha carreira na cobertura sobre periferias, então eu fui repórter, fui do grupo de gestão da agência também. E desde o início do ano passado, 2020, eu trabalho com checagem de fatos. Atualmente eu trabalho no Aos Fatos. É uma agência brasileira especializada em fact-checking.
Primeiramente, agradecer aí a oportunidade de falar com todo mundo. Eu queria falar um pouco, né, sobre como eu comecei, e foi em 1999, já faz muito tempo. Eu comecei fazendo revistas de hip hop, rap e cultura urbana em São Paulo. E fiquei durante 10 anos editando revistas de cultura urbana, principalmente que abordavam rap e grafite. E acho que ali foi um pouco da minha grande experiência em rodar o Brasil inteiro e todas as periferias, fazendo esse tipo de trabalho jornalístico, entrevistando e falando com as pessoas de várias partes do Brasil. Hip hop é muito grande no Brasil e, enfim, fiquei 10 anos fazendo isso e depois iniciei um site que chama Catraca Livre, que é um veículo de comunicação focado em eventos em São Paulo, em juntar material gratuito, oportunidades para estudantes, e tenho trabalhado como freelance em diversos veículos, como agência pública, que é uma agência de jornalismo investigativo aqui no Brasil, mas também já trabalhei em mais de 20 veículos, publicando nos mais diversos jornais. E em 2010 eu comecei a fazer jornalismo e quadrinhos, eu juntei minhas duas paixões, que era o jornalismo e os quadrinhos, e desde então venho trabalhando em diversos veículos.
That's brilliant. Now I'm going to screen share your story here because you chose like a very unique format to actually set it up. You know, Favela versus COVID-19 is a multimedia story. And I wanted to ask you, I don't know whether Priscila or Alexandre can do this best. Could one of you please summarize the story for us in case there's attendants who haven't read it?
Claro. Então, essa reportagem, o foco dela é mostrar as iniciativas tomadas pela população de regiões periféricas para lidar com a Covid-19. Então, na ausência do Estado, de políticas públicas, o que a população fez para poder lidar com questões sobre saúde, por exemplo, orientar as pessoas a usar máscara, a higienizar as mãos, explicar sobre a importância do distanciamento social. Por isso que um dos tópicos da matéria é mostrar que teve gente que saiu pelas ruas com um caminhão de som, passando informação, com o médico do posto de saúde, ações relacionadas à economia, verificar quem estava precisando de comida. Então, o fio condutor dessa reportagem é o jornalismo de soluções. Quais são as soluções que os moradores tomaram iniciativa de praticar na ausência do Estado, e como essas soluções, apesar de serem paliativas, porque a população ela tem um poder de alcance menor do que o poder público, como essas soluções elas podem servir de exemplos para outras regiões e para o próprio poder público, que tem muito mais força, poder agir. Então, acho que o maior exemplo são os presidentes de rua, por exemplo, que saíam de casa em casa para informar a população, ver as necessidades, esse tipo de coisa.
A gente também teve um desafio gráfico, que foi fazer toda a matéria em jornalismo em quadrinhos e contar tudo isso, né, dessa forma, e adicionar depois fotos, áudios e enriquecer o material. Mas o objetivo foi transformar, né, e fazer com que todo esse conteúdo estivesse dentro de uma história em quadrinhos e que fosse de uma leitura fácil. E para isso a gente teve que ir em vários lugares e recolher também muito material de arquivo para que as pessoas se sintam, né, dentro daquela matéria, daquele universo. Então foi também muito desafiador a parte gráfica, além de toda a dificuldade de trabalhar ali na pandemia.
And I'm a bit curious, why did you decide on a multimedia format and not on a narrative format, like a written format or a documentary? What attracted you to doing this more as a comic book cartoon, really, than doing it as a narrative or something written?
Foi uma escolha do próprio Outrider, o site polonês. Antes, eu havia feito um trabalho de compilamento para o Outrider. Existe um site chamado Radar, onde há iniciativas realizadas pela população contra a Covid-19 em todo o mundo, e eu fiquei responsável por compilar as iniciativas da América Latina. Então, eu fiz uma varredura, não lembro quantas ações eu encontrei agora, mas foram centenas, desde o Uruguai até o México, e entre as histórias que eu encontrei, entre as iniciativas, foram justamente algumas no Brasil, foram essas de Paraisópolis, Heliópolis, Brasilândia, e a Lola, que é uma das editoras do Outrider, ela voltou a falar comigo, porque eles achavam interessante ampliar a história, porque no radar era só o resumo, um pequeno resumo de cada iniciativa. E eles queriam ampliar, contar mais dessas histórias, e eles haviam se interessado por essas três que nós detalhamos. E como eu já havia feito quadrinhos com Alexandre de Maio, na época que eu trabalhava na agência Mural, ela me fez esse convite e convidou o Alexandre de Maio. Então, foi uma ideia que já veio do próprio Outrider, que já tem uma história de fazer, uma trajetória de fazer produções multimídia, de fazer produções inovadoras, e eles nunca tinham trabalhado com quadrinhos. Então, eles queriam complementar, fazer reportagens em quadrinhos nessa linha que já com a experiência de fazer materiais multimídias em outros formatos.
And you guys worked with a cross-border team in Poland and in Spain. What was that like, and what was some of the biggest challenges working with sort of team members in a different time zone, in a different country?
Bom, para mim, acho que assim, tudo foi muito bem organizado. Acho que quando a gente trabalha numa equipe multimídia, uma equipe com pessoas em diferentes países, com diferentes habilidades, é muito importante que tenha uma organização, que tenha uma liderança. Isso a gente teve. Então, o nosso ponto de contato sempre foi a Lola, a coordenadora do projeto. Então, isso ajudou muito, facilitou muito o contato, porque era ela para quem a gente se reportava. Eu acho que o desafio, pelo menos para mim, foi lidar com os diferentes sotaques. Quando a gente fez a reunião em inglês, e cada um ali tinha um sotaque diferente, assim, para entender. Acho que foi um desafio essa questão da língua. Fuso horário não foi um problema, a gente trabalhou, as reuniões eram no fuso horário europeu, então a gente fez reunião quando era parte da manhã no Brasil e tarde na Europa. Então, da minha parte, acho que foi mais essa questão um pouco da diferença de sotaques. Acho que principalmente porque ainda não sou tão fluente, mas tudo no fim fluiu bem nas conversas. A gente também tinha um canal no... Ai, fugiu o nome agora. No
Slack.
No Slack, que facilitava a comunicação.
Eu acho que a gente teve, como o jornalismo em quadrinhos em si é um formato novo para a equipe do Outright, a gente teve que discutir alguns conceitos de arte, de como conduzir a história, e com a dificuldade de estar fazendo um formato um pouco novo, que precisava de bastante conversas em alinhamentos, essa distância dificultou um pouco nesse perfeito alinhamento ali, mas no final tudo deu muito certo, a equipe funcionou super bem, mas toda vez que a gente está fazendo, eu tenho feito em muitos veículos jornalismo em quadrinhos, e quando o veículo nunca fez, tem bastante coisa para ser conversada e ser acordada, e acho que juntou um pouco essa dificuldade de uma equipe internacional e de estar fazendo um formato novo. Mas no final tudo fluiu super bem, e é uma quantidade de material, pelo tempo que a gente conseguiu fazer, isso foi uma experiência incrível, assim.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And we'll be coming back to you later in the webinar as well to ask a wrap-up question. So now I'm going to bring this webinar to Clair MacDougall, who's based out in Burkina Faso. Clair, tell us, how did you get your start in journalism? How long have you been at it? And most importantly, how did you end up in Africa?
Sure. So I've been a journalist for about a decade. Now worked on the student newspaper at university. I'm Australian, so I sort of started out there. And I really love travel. So I ended up interning on a fantastic paper in Delhi called the Indian Express. And then I worked on a rural paper in Australia in a city called Wagga Wagga, went to journalism school, and one of my professors at journalism school was a journalist who had started out his career in West Africa, and I decided I'd like to follow in his footsteps and go to West Africa. So that's pretty much how I ended up there. And I started out in Ghana, was in Liberia for a number of years and reported on the Ebola epidemic there, and I'm in Burkina Faso now.
Did you end up learning French as well to get around?
Yeah, well, I mean, you definitely have to here. It's sort of a very sort of francophone country, and there are not many people who speak English, so I have to get by in French.
So we're going to share your story here with everyone. Just in case there are attendants who haven't read it, could you give us a summary of the story? It was very in-depth and very detailed. I have to say I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. Yeah, so my story was basically about the first alleged death from COVID-19 of a UN peacekeeper. And it was an interesting story for me because initially it sort of started out as a story about ritual and sort of institutions. And, I was very interested in looking at protocols in the UN and how sort of like death and the handling of death had changed due to COVID-19. But what I ended up finding through contacting the family of Carlos Guillen and his friends and so on were concerns about a lack of transparency about how he had died of COVID-19, whether there were questions about whether or not he even died of COVID-19 at all. And I sort of started, I guess, digging from there and sort of looking at medical records, asking the UN mission that he was on, questions about how his particular case was handled. He was, from El Salvador and stationed in Mali, the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali as a helicopter pilot, and it's one of the deadliest missions in the world. So, there was, I guess, having covered a epidemic, pandemic, the Ebola pandemic before, I sort of, immediately had lots of questions about how they were managing this situation in a peacekeeping mission.
So something I'm curious about, how did you actually find this story? How did you stumble upon it in the first place and then decided to pursue it?
Sure. Well, I basically had sort of found out about reports of, I think that there were basically the first two deaths, and I lived in Liberia and there was a major sort of UN peacekeeping mission there. So the United Nations and the peacekeeping missions have always interested me. And I just sort of came across it through that way, and I started talking with my editor about it, Dulcie Lambach at Pass Blue, and it sort of initially was going to be a very short story, and then more and more questions started coming up, and it was sort of an interesting story. I really wasn't sure how it was going to end, but yeah, it ended up going from being a short story to being a much longer story. So.
And you did this entire investigation from home. And I have to say the amount of detail that went into this investigation is really impressive. How did you manage to do the entire story from home? And importantly, how did you manage to get a hold of the few documents that you did?
Yeah, sure. So for me, that was a real challenge, doing an investigation entirely from home, because I'm very sort of, like to get on the ground, like to meet people face to face. But with sort of the circumstances, and the fact that the peacekeeping mission is in Mali, and the issues with COVID, it was difficult, and the fact that the man who died was in El Salvador, there were a lot of challenges. But basically, it initially started out, I started making records requests with the Department of Peace Operations in New York about sort of like the number of deaths, the number of infections, and so on. And frustratingly, that information isn't actually public, so you have to ask for it and continually ask for it. And then I started getting in contact with family members and friends of Carlos Guillen through Facebook, and there was a real network of former pilots who had served on UN peacekeeping missions. So I started contacting them. And in terms of the records, the family did have some records that they had, but they weren't complete. And they didn't have certain things like, the original death certificate, and other documents. And, I guess I kept on asking them, why don't you have these documents? And, the UN said that they'd given the documents, they kept on requesting from the hospital, but they were just unable to get these records. And other things that I sort of, that I did, for example, we used obviously WhatsApp messages between Carlos and his wife, in the hours leading up to his death, where they tragically fell out of contact. And then also, just when they had the funeral, video footage, from family members and friends. So for me, it was a really, I guess, interesting way of trying to think through different means of gathering information than actually sort of being on the ground. And I think that, I guess the pandemic has, created all sorts of challenges and opportunities for news gathering and finding information for a lot of journalists everywhere.
I think if I remember correctly, though correct me if I'm wrong, there was a part in the story that was quite interesting where, was it a hospital official who said they don't issue death certificates in Spanish, yet the family received some kind of paperwork in Spanish noting his time of death. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly that some form of death certificate had been translated into Spanish, and that was, like a real issue. And the family kept on requesting directly from the hospital to have all of his documents. And, I think the thing that really sort of shocked me is you had this family who were, like struggling to access information about someone who was incredibly close to them. And I, obviously there's a part in the story where I call up the hospital and, they give me all of these details, I get to speak to the doctor, and they give me all of these details about, like how, he became sick, how he fell ill, even sort of like sent a lung scan and so on, but the family still can't get this information. And I think for me, I was quite sort of, I was quite taken aback, by the fact that I was able to get access to that, information, but the family had been trying and trying and trying and hadn't been able to.
Now, I'm a bit curious because you spoke with the family members, and I take it you had to have a high level of sensitivity when writing the story. Did this story bring closure to his wife and his family on some level after you published it? Did you manage to share a copy with them, maybe in Spanish?
Yeah, so we ended up, I mean, the great thing about doing this story as well, was my editor was very supportive of having it translated, into Spanish. So, it ended up being shared in Spanish. But I still think that the family, since I last spoke to them, was really struggling to get those records. And, I think you see at the end of the story, because there hasn't been this transparency. His wife has all of these questions about, was his body even in the coffin, and, all of these questions because, they haven't been given that access to information. And, in many ways, when I was speaking with her, it seemed as though, they felt like they needed that kind of information to get some kind of closure, and they weren't being given access to it, because of all sorts of reasons regarding how information is handled within the UN peacekeeping system, and the role that troop contributing countries play, in these missions as well.
You mentioned in our pre-call that one of your biggest challenges was verifying information for this story. How did you manage to overcome that challenge?
Sure. I mean, I think that the story, there are many unanswered questions in the story, and I think that we still do not know exactly what happened with Carlos Guillen's case. But, I spoke to a number of sources in Mali, some of which I can't obviously I can't obviously name, but yeah, basically I had contacts in the, some contacts in the mission, some contacts in Mali itself, and having worked there before, because I covered the elections in Mali in 2018, I kind of knew who could be approached and so on, and yeah, it was a very sort of challenging story, but I think in many ways the story is as complete as it is as we could tell it, and I think that the story is essentially about also about what we don't know, as much as it is about what we do know.
Thank you so much, Claire, and I'll be coming back to you later in the webinar. And now we're going to introduce Amir, who wrote this fantastic story about a New Orleans sanitation workers strike. In the context of Black Lives Matter, and it's very reminiscent of the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers strike that took place in an era where Martin Luther King was fighting for the equality of Blacks here in America. Amir, so tell us your story. How did you get a start in journalism? And I noticed on your webpage you have a particular focus on labor. And why is that? Why did that become your focus?
First off, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm really excited about this. So how did I get started? How did I get started in journalism? I would say I always had an interest in journalism, but it was something that coming from the background I came from, it didn't seem that it was something that was doable. It didn't seem that it was a realistic profession to go into, especially with so many journalists being out of work and so many media outlets going, out of business. So I decided to study urban studies, and I focused on the urban environment. I focused on labor, and I was really interested in getting a foundation in that. So when I did eventually have this idea that I was going to go back into journalism, and I was going to try to pursue that, but at least I would have this foundation of understanding how labor works, labor history, urban history, and the urban environment. And then I started, the funny thing was I was taking term papers I was working on in Queens College during my master's degree program, and I was changing them up after I got the term papers, and I would make them journalistic pieces, and then I would try to submit them into Jacobin, for instance, or in these times, and it worked. And I was getting some notoriety and publicity because of my work, so it gave me the confidence to go into journalism. Labor, I come from an activist organizing background. I worked in nonprofits for about 10 years. I worked in with labor unions and different nonprofit organizations. I was in Occupy Wall Street. I was in a variety of different social movements and grassroots movements. So I have an intrinsic interest in labor and all things social justice. So that's kind of where my interest of exploring how, I feel like labor is underreported. Oftentimes there's not many journalists on labor beats. It's really hard to get good information on what's going on inside unions, what's going on in terms of strikes. So I feel that was something that I can help contribute to the overall knowledge of what's going on in the labor movement.
Brilliant. And just as I've asked everyone else, in case there are attendees or people watching the live stream who haven't read your story, could you give us a summary of what this story is about?
It's a beautiful story. Well, it's a story I found. It wasn't at first it wasn't widely reported, and I often read the World Socialist website because I find that they have a good labor beat, and that's how I kind of stumbled upon that this was happening. So the story is interesting because it's where class, labor, race, and healthcare all converge. And to me, this was the story of the pandemic that was often being overlooked. It's a story about sanitation workers in New Orleans now that were on strike because of the poor labor conditions, the poor health conditions. They weren't receiving the proper PPE. They weren't receiving the proper protections that were needed to prevent them from getting COVID. Many of the workers were getting sick with COVID. And it was a story about the history of the sanitation department in New Orleans. Sometime in the 90s, the sanitation department was privatized, and 3 companies, private companies, took over the trash collection in the entire city. In New York City, to be a trash collector or sanitation worker is a dream job for many. You can make oftentimes 6 figures. You can retire relatively comfortable. You have health care. You have a pension. It's a very sought after job that thousands of people apply for every time the exam comes up, and that happens rarely, every few 5 or 6 years. In New Orleans, sanitation workers make less than minimum wage. It's oftentimes it's a job in which it's controlled by temp agencies. If you work for a sanitation company that controls the trash collecting in the city, you will not work directly for that company. The subcontractors subcontract the hiring to these temp agencies. It's a job where you don't know from one day to the next if you're going to be able to work, but it's also a highly dangerous job. So the workers in New Orleans were for a long time contemplating forming a union, but the COVID-19 pandemic really spurred them to action, and they took that opportunity to flex their labor power. And currently they're still on strike, and they're still fighting for their dignity.
Now, you didn't shy away from a lot of the complexities in this story. For example, the sanitation company is a Black-owned business.
Yes.
You noted that in the story. The fact that they had contracted out, I mean, what amounted to it was prison labor, right? To
Yes,
try
they
to
did.
break up the strike. I'm really kind of fascinated. How did you manage to get into those details of the story? How did you find those things? And out of curiosity, did you write this entire story from New York City, or did you travel to New Orleans for any of it?
All from New York City. I wanted to go. I like to be on the ground. I like to breathe the air that the people that I'm covering are breathing. I like to be and see what they're seeing and be on the ground and feel that energy. And I couldn't do that. But this was a story that I felt was so important. It was a story that was being overlooked, like I mentioned earlier. And I did everything I could to try to bring myself there, even though I couldn't be there. I did immense amounts of research. I did Zoom phone calls with a lot of the workers, and I studied the history of New Orleans very intricately. I studied the history of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. I tried to put it in that context of where they're coming from, where these workers were living, where the environments they were coming, so I can try to give the reader a sense of what it's like to be there, and where this isn't coming out of nothing. This isn't coming out of a vacuum. This is something that was building for a long time. In terms of that was probably one of the most difficult parts to figure out, because this was kind of like a rumor, and it was hard to find out concretely if this was something that was happening. But I heard it from the workers that they were doing, and then it was reported once or twice, but I couldn't find out what that company was. So I had to dig into the history of prison labor in the city of New Orleans and in the county, the greater county that New Orleans is in. And I was able to get confirmation from the company themselves that that's actually exactly what they were doing. And they did it very briefly, but I thought it was ironic that a Black-owned company was hiring slave labor, essentially to break a strike by Black workers, led by Black workers. And that's something that wasn't often covered in the stories I was reading.
Something else that was interesting that you had also uncovered, that this company was paying below minimum wage for the state of Louisiana.
Yes.
Are they going to face any repercussions or be held accountable for that? Because I imagine they were paying below minimum wage for years before they raised it.
Thus far, I haven't heard anything in terms of if we're going to face any kind of repercussion. The city of New Orleans is complicit in this. They created the environment for the exploitation of these workers to happen. They were allowing this to happen since the 90s. These workers were being exploited, mistreated, and I'm sure they were being underpaid. Anything short of a class action lawsuit by some of these workers, I don't know if the city will do anything about it. Since then, the company now does pay minimum wage. So there's, I don't know if it was a result of this story or just the public outcry in general. The company, in order to cover their own hide, they're now I don't want to say they're doing the right thing, but they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. The right
Yeah.
thing is to recognize these workers' dignity and allow them to form a union.
Now, your story also included some really powerful photographs, like this one that I'm sharing right now on our screen. This sanitation worker holding up a sign, "I am man," like very reminiscent of the Memphis sanitation strikes. And I think, they definitely understood their history using that sign. How did you manage to get these photos while in New York
So
City?
those photos were not mine. That was with the editor's help, and they contracted that out to another photographer. And that's how they were able to get those photos. They were beautiful photos. I wish I took them myself. If I would like to, that the idea of the Memphis connecting the work that these workers are doing, the strike that these workers are doing to what happened in Memphis in 1968 was something that they came up with themselves. One of the workers, his name was, let me see, I have it, Jonathan Edwards, had lived in Memphis at one point, and he knew the history of the sanitation strike and with Dr. King, and that was actually the last public speech that Dr. King gave to help these workers in Memphis. So they knew that history, and while they were working at the this company called Metro in New Orleans, they saw a lot of the same similarities that were happening back then was happening. The exact same stuff, if not worse, was happening now. At least the workers in Memphis at that time were actually city employees. Here, with neoliberalism becoming so rampant, especially in the South, these workers are subcontracted by a subcontractor. There's 3 degrees of separation between them and the city. So they're not technically employees of anyone. They're considered temp workers. So they saw that happening. They saw that connection, and it was very relevant to them. It was a living history that they were experiencing, as well as with what was happening with that time with Black Lives Matter was resurging, and all these protests happening all over the country regarding the death of Black bodies. Right? They saw they were being killed slower. They weren't getting shot by the cops, but they were being slowly killed. Their bodies were slowly becoming deteriorated based on this job, and they realized that they weren't being treated as human beings. And then "I am a man" was the slogan that was used in Memphis, and that was something they adopted for their struggle that continues to this moment.
What would you say was your biggest challenge working on this story during the pandemic, and how did you manage to overcome it?
I think the biggest challenge for me was to build a sense of place. A lot of the reporting that had happened prior to this article did not give a sense of history or place. That's why I feel it's very important for me to be in these places that I report on, because I want the reader to walk with me, to see what I see, to see what my subjects that I'm covering are seeing, and to really get the essence of what's happening. I don't like to swoop in and do helicopter reporting. I like to build relationships, and I like to have the people that I'm working with on a story actually come and participate in the story with me. And it was hard to do that when you're in New York City, and this is happening in New Orleans. So I thankfully build a very nice long distance relationship with the workers. And we were doing Zoom calls, and we were on the phone a few times a week, and we were discussing what was happening. And they were giving me on the ground reports as if they were doing the reporting on the ground for me. And I was able to formulate that into this piece. And without them, this piece would never have come about, as well as doing a lot of research on just the history of New Orleans and where this fits in context to the racial and economic disparities that exist in that city, because this is not an isolated event. I connect this to what happened with the charter schools in New Orleans, and they converted many of their schools, if not all of their public schools, into charter schools, and the destruction of public housing in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. This all was about the same neoliberal context. They also tried to privatize the water supply a few years ago in New Orleans, and that was thankfully defeated by public pressure. So there was this effort to privatize the whole entire city, and now we're seeing people fighting back against it, and I think that's really admirable and inspiring.
Thank you so much, Amir. And I guess that brings
Thank
us
you.
to our wrap-up question. I'm going to work backwards, and I'm going to start this wrap-up question with you, Amir. What is your
Please.
key piece of advice based on everything you've learned reporting in the past year for reporters seeking to produce this type of in-depth story during the pandemic that you would give as like sort of your lesson learned from the past year?
I think what I've learned is read. I think reading is very important, and just staying as informed as possible about everything. I think I never know where I'm going to get an idea for a story, but I spend a lot of time just reading, just trying to sift through a lot of the reporting that's out there already. A lot of times something is reporting comes about, they're just 1-2 paragraph snippets of something that's happening somewhere, and you don't think too much about it. But I try to read everything. I read like the Trotskyist newspapers, which do great reporting on local labor struggles. I read local news, like we have here in Queens, New York, the Queens Ledger and the Queens Tribune. They usually do 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraph stories just on something local. But oftentimes those local stories are a great snapshot at something that's happening nationally, and you can really get an idea of bigger picture things by just reading those kind of things. So I've learned to just be patient and read and take your time and try to find as much input as possible. We got nothing but time now. So we can just spend time reading and thinking, and then before you know it, an idea is going to come and going to help you shape your story. Does that answer your question?
Most definitely. Thank you so
Okay.
much. And
Thank you.
Claire, what's your biggest lesson learned from this past year in terms of producing an in-depth story like the one you did that you'd like to share with other reporters?
I think a few things. I mean, I think I agree with Amir, this sort of need to be patient. I think that, the pandemic is obviously, still with us and is going to go on for some time. And I think it's just, very important to sort of, I guess, check in with people and to really listen to them and their struggles that they're facing, in the face of this all. And also, I think that an interesting thing for me is like, I think that because as a result of the pandemic, obviously I like to do my reporting on the ground and be face to face with people and speak with them. But I think that the isolation that has resulted from the pandemic has opened up, people open up over the phone in a way that they didn't before, which is my experience. So I think that, don't make the assumption that just because you're not on the ground that you can't report on something. There's a possibility of having long conversations with people and, touching base with them and just, be patient and listen to what people have to say and be patient with the story as well, because stories change and evolve and, can become deeper as well.
Thank you so much, Claire. Alexandre, what's your biggest lesson learned during this past year, during the pandemic, when it comes to producing stories or artwork or illustration that you've been doing? Oh, you're muted. Let me unmute you. Oh, there you go.
A maior lição que eu tirei foi que, pelo menos aqui no Brasil, foi possível ir a campo no meio da pandemia, tomando os devidos cuidados e entendendo um novo jeito de fazer jornalismo, né, numa nova realidade, mas mesmo para o quadrinho ou, né, como protesto, ir a campo é muito importante porque a gente conseguiu realmente mostrar o que estava acontecendo e fica um aprendizado também pessoal e humano de ver que pessoas que não têm às vezes nem o que comer dentro de casa estão ajudando as outras, estão tomando iniciativas. Então, esse tipo de relação humana, de riqueza humana que a gente encontra nesse tipo de reportagem, eu acho que é um combustível para continuar fazendo reportagens desse tipo, né? Era um tema que eu pessoalmente queria falar muito, então acho que fica aí como dica para os repórteres que quando tem, né, o grande motivador, o grande combustível é a boa história, é querer contar algo que está acontecendo e mostrar uma realidade aí que as poucas pessoas viram.
Bom, nós tivemos sim, a oportunidade de ir a campo em Paraisópolis, mas também teve o desafio de fazer à distância a produção de Heliópolis e Brasilândia. Então, acho que o que eu aprendi é quanto é desafiador fazer uma reportagem em quadrinhos nos lugares onde você não pode ir. Então, acho que é importante ter paciência e prezar pelo diálogo com as pessoas, com os entrevistados, porque você vai depender delas também para enviar imagens, para descrever. Então, uma dica que eu dou para quem quer fazer algo ilustrativo, algo em quadrinhos e não dá para ir a campo por causa da pandemia, valorizar durante a entrevista perguntas que façam com que o entrevistado descreva a cena, fez uma ação de entrega de alimentos, como que é o lugar onde vocês circulam, como é feito a entrega. Então, prezar pela descrição, pedir para as pessoas descreverem. Nessa questão dos quadrinhos, outra sugestão que eu dou e que eu tenho aprendido ao longo do tempo, eu não desenho, mas eu preciso entender do desenho para montar um roteiro que tenha sintonia com o que o quadrinista vá desenhar. Então, a minha sugestão é consuma quadrinhos, consuma livros, livro-reportagem mesmo. Por exemplo, nesse momento eu estou lendo esse quadrinhos aqui em inglês do Felipe Scarzoni. Acho que o Alexandre de Maio pode dar mais sugestões, mas Joy Sacco, por exemplo, que é uma referência. Então, consuma livro, reportagem, quadrinhos, tanto do Joy Sacco, que é uma referência mundial, quanto de artistas, de quadrinistas da sua região. E de tudo, tenha paciência, porque realmente fazer trabalho à distância, reportagem à distância, acho que é um pouco mais complicado, porque você precisa, um diálogo à distância e você precisa criar empatia. Também tenho esse. É isso, muito obrigada pela oportunidade.
Thank you guys for this opportunity as well. So I'm just going to give it to audience questions. If you're in the audience and you have a question and you want to type it in on the Zoom chat, please do so now. So we can probably spend the last 5 or 10 minutes with an audience discussion, or if anyone is on Facebook and would like to give us a question, I'm checking that as well. Please let us know. Let's see. I don't see any questions here. Maybe you guys are so thorough that no questions are necessary. You guys covered everything in your stories. Oh, no other questions from the audience? Going once? Going twice? Going 3 times? All right. Well, in that case, thank you again so much for joining us today, and a big congratulations to all of you as our top winners. I also want to give a very special thank you to Natalia Rio Preto, who is our interpreter today from Brazilian to Portuguese. She did a really excellent job, and I'm glad that I've finally learned how to use simultaneous interpretation here on Zoom. So just flagging for everyone in our forum, next week we're going to have Dr. Gallet Alter from Harvard University School of Medicine explain to us how the COVID-19 vaccines work. And that's going to be hosted by our very own Vice President of Content and Community, Patrick Butler. So please stay tuned for that. To all of you, a big congratulations again. Thank you so much. And we're so glad that you are our forum members and our story contest winners. I hope you all stay safe and you all continue producing really excellent stories for this year.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Tchau, tchau.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.